My name is Matthew, and I'm a hardcore biker. I own a GSXR motorcycle, a pretty fast bike in case you didn't know. I live in Grands Lagoon, Trinidad. Today was my second cousin's birthday, and my other cousins and I kept a little get-together for him. My encounter started when I left my home around midnight to get some snacks as the ones we had gotten before had been dissipated. The closest mini-mart was located out of town, about 2.5-hour drive under the speed limits. But being a biker, I loved speed. As I was about half a mile outside of town, driving on about 100 miles per hour, I accidentally hit the kill switch on the bike and it came off. I cautiously pulled over to the side of the road and hopped off. I then laughed at myself for making such a rookie mistake. It took me a few minutes after laughing at myself to realize something really odd. The entire area was completely quiet. Not just any kind of quiet. The type of quiet that makes a ringing sound in your ear. I stood there looking around, contributing to the surrounding quietness. But it was everywhere. Nothing was out tonight. Usually, you hear common bugs, like crickets and so on. But there was nothing. Memory soon kicked in, as I remembered overhearing my dad and his friend's conversation on hunting. His friend said, "Always remember when out there, if the woods get quiet, be cautious. It means there's a predator around." I quickly got quiet and paced myself and walked back to the bike feeling rather threatened. But there was nothing here. I hopped on my bike and turned the key, watching my dashboard light up. And that's when I heard it. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the road in front of me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as chills ran down my spine, signaling for me to get out of there. I stood there paralyzed with fear as my body denied the signals from my brain. And at that moment came a low growl. I stood there, overthinking what to do, as it growled once more. I quickly snapped out of it and pushed the start button on the bike and turned the headlights on. That was the biggest mistake of my life, because the sight that presented itself to me could never be unseen. 15 feet in front of me stood this thing. I'm saying thing because I've never seen anything like it before. Nothing on this earth resembles this. And I would consider myself an Animal Planet freak. It stood on its hind legs, about 7 feet tall with pale white skin and yellowish eyes. At first, I thought it could have been a bear, but there are no bears where I'm from. Its arms and legs were elongated and weird looking. It looked as if it were wearing an old tattered black fur coat. It was hunched over in the middle of the road looking right at me. It stared at me as if it saw a human for the first time. "What are you?" I asked, with a frightened voice. It stared at me for a few more minutes and then said, "What are you?" in the same exact context and sound. My heart dropped as this thing took a step towards me. At this point, I was too scared to think of anything. This thing literally just repeated what I said in my own voice. They quickly kicked the bike into first gear, turned the bike back toward the road, and started riding. As I revved the throttle, it let out a blood-curdling, ear-piercing scream as I rode off. I caught myself watching back ever so often, making sure I wasn't being pursued. I made it home safe that night. But now, I never go out after midnight. Especially not on that road. If any of you have any idea what this could have been, please let me know.
I'm 28 now, but I was 8 or 9 at the time. That was late spring. I lived at 145 Coney Avenue, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, just opposite of Marie, Michigan. My mom had just put me into bed around 9 p.m. and opened my window to cool off my room. I laid awake for the next few hours, tossing and turning. I was restless and felt uneasy. I opened my eyes to get up for a drink, but to my surprise, I saw a tall man in scraggly clothes, pacing back and forth by my bed, looking down at me. It was dark, but I could tell it was in the shape of a man. I pulled my blankets up to my nose and I was terrified. I was frozen, unable to make a sound and barely able to move. Just moving my blanket felt like I was lifting a sheet of wet cement. As he or it continued to pace, I could hear popping and crackling sounds, unlike anything I had ever heard before up to this point in my life. Suddenly, the eyes seemed to gain eye shine like a wild animal, and the legs began to bend and he grew tall, almost hissing its head on my ceiling. The face of this thing also began to distort. If you've seen a movie howl, that's how the legs looked. And if you've seen the movie Howling, the face began to look like the creepy dude with the fur coat of the colony. As this thing continued to shapeshift, I began to cry. And as I began to yell, it started to reach out towards me. This stirred my mother, who woke up and began to get up and come to my room. The creature stopped reaching for me, looked over his shoulder, sneering. Then it quickly made its way to the window. It looked back at me, still transforming, and flashed me a toothy grin. Then it jumped through the window out into my yard. My mother, thank goodness, came into my room and asked me what was wrong. As I frantically tried to explain what I saw, she chalked it up to too much sugar before bed, even though she even stepped in the wet footprints left by the thing. She just figured the late rain must have picked up and come in the window. She didn't even bother to turn on the lights to see if it was footprints. She picked me up, and as I looked over her shoulder, I saw the thing. It fully changed outside in the yard. It now looked like the werewolves in the movie Dog Soldiers, which hadn't even been made at the time. But there it was, just staring back at me. Like it knew it could just still get me if it wanted to. I yelled and told my mum to look, but before she could see it, it ran off around the large 8-foot-tall fence in our yard, into the brush between my house and my neighbours. She walked over and closed the window. She told me that monsters aren't real, but I knew differently. Since this time, I began to ask my father about First Nation legends and began looking into other belief systems that had shape-shifting lycanthropes. I'm now 28 and have researched a lot about werewolves, skinwalkers, berserkers, Lepguru, and Jaguar men, and all things of this nature. I've even begun looking into how to become one, like wearing a wolfskin belt or drinking from the paw print of a wolf on a full moon. I now have a bear and a wolf claw necklace, a wolf pelt I wear on occasion, full moons. And I've been trying to get an audience with my father's friend who's a chief up near Waipuku, First Nation reserves in the James B. Lowlands. But my father says he won't speak of such things, as he sees talking about them draws him to you, and puts you and your family in danger. My story starts as me and my cousin were home alone on a warm summer's day. she and I were sitting on the living room floor, sewing, as that was the only interesting thing we could do that day. We had a fan in the opened window, as it gets really hot in Manchester during the summer. The fan was blowing cool air into the overheated house. I could remember that it was not a windy day whatsoever. Remember this detail, because it is very important throughout the story. Me and my cousin were just sitting there having a conversation about something that I can't specifically remember, when all of a sudden, the fan falls out of the window. It was one of those box-like fans that if I think about it now, even if it was wind, I don't think it would have been strong enough to knock it over. Me and my cousin did think it was a wind at first, so we put the fan back up and continued sewing. Not that long after, I heard a crash and looked up to see the fan had fallen over by itself again. Once again, we chalked it up to the wind and put it back up. But then it happened again. Then again. We started getting a little skeptical and went to see if it was the wind, but there was no wind or nothing. It was a nice, really hot summer's day. Right after that, all of a sudden, all the doors inside the house started opening and closing constantly. We knew for a fact this was not the wind, as even the doors on the outside of the house were opening, like the bedroom doors, the laundry room door, the front door, and the garage door, etc. We got a little spooked out, so my cousin ended up calling her ex-boyfriend's mum, who according to my cousin was a spiritual person who knew about this kind of stuff. This lady ended up answering the phone, and we quickly explained to her what was happening. She told us that we had to go find a Bible. I obediently went into my grandparents' room because I knew they had a few different Bibles in their closet. Once we got the Bible, the lady on the phone told us that we had to open it to a random page, then join hands. We joined hands, then the lady told us to repeat after her. She then started saying some type of prayer that I never heard before. We did as she asked and repeated the prayer. The doors started opening and closing faster and more violently as we kept saying the prayer. And all of a sudden, the strangest thing ended up happening. The second we said the final word of the prayer, everything just stopped. Go quiet. Everything went back to normal. This event has impacted me in quite a few different ways. I started becoming way more interested in all things paranormal and supernatural. I researched and found out all the information I could on all things paranormal. From all the research I have done, I have concluded that what was in that house was something called a poltergeist. A poltergeist is a type of ghost that is able to move or throw things, and is also capable of making really loud noises. This is the only type of ghost I could figure out that could move all those doors. I have since been back to that house, but also with equipment I have rather made or purchased online. I have also experienced other things from doing this type of stuff. I think this experience will impact my life forever.
When I was about 12, my dad decided to go to Holland with my grandmother and other family members. My mother and 2 siblings and I stayed home. I'm the middle child, but am the oldest boy. With my dad being gone, I had to do the chores. It was winter, and I live on a farm, so I had to tend to the animals. Since it gets cold in the night, the animal water freezes. We raised 2 beef each year for meat. I got up at 4, as I had to do the whole time my father was gone. Because I had school, I got dressed and headed outside. This was my 5th day or so of doing this. It was still dark out. There was a clear sky allowing me to see the moon and stars through the trees. I could see me breathe as I walked to the barn. I noticed that it was unusually quiet. Normally, the cows moo at me when they hear or see me. I walked into the barn and fed them their grain and alfalfa hay. I went over and broke the ice in their water trough. I fed the 3 cats we had at the time. Only one is around today. I then went around the back of our barn to look at the moon. The sky was just starting to show signs of approaching morning. All of a sudden, the cows flew out of the barn and ran straight through the damn fence. They continued running into the pasture along the creek. I then saw this 6 to 7 foot tall creature run the same direction but along the creek in the opposite direction. It made its way into the woods in a matter of seconds. Once it was in the woods, I could kind of smell a nasty smell, but maybe it was just the cows or something. I was right behind the barn. One thing that is crazy about it is that it was almost completely silent. The only time it made noise is when it stepped into the puddles along the creek. I began walking back to the house when I realized there was something in the barn. I slowly snuck over. I looked through the crack in the door, and I couldn't believe my eyes. This thing was eating the corn out of the cow's grain. One by one, every grain of it. He then looked towards the door and stood up. He looked around. He then grabbed a brick my dad uses to hold the tarp down over our grain, because our barn leaks, and threw it towards the door where I was at. I jumped and started to shake. I was in such disbelief that I actually hit myself in the head, hoping I was hallucinating. I could feel the adrenaline in me rushing like crazy. I decided to peek again. I looked through the crack, but everything was dark. I soon realized that I was looking at this ugly bitch in the face. I scooped gravel off the ground and flung it in the crack and ran. I turned and looked at the barn. This thing jumped out the window on the side and ran towards me. It jumped the fence and was gaining fast. I ran to the house and the damn door was locked. I ran to the garage and it was open. I managed to get in and I waited there for about 5 minutes. I slowly opened the door to peek. Our garage was separate from our house, so I had to do a big 10-stride run to the back door. I sprinted and made it inside, thanking God the door was unlocked. I looked at the window and turned the garage light on. I about died when I realized it was only 10 feet away. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't think they would believe me. I've only told my sister, and the only reason I told her was because within the last year, she started going in the woods. She has found footprints. She has also had glimpses of them. I never let her go alone anymore. Whatever I saw, I'm sure is a Bigfoot. If the natives have any cave carvings and paintings of them, including many legends, then why can't they exist? I don't believe, I know. We find in the same paintings a saber-toothed tiger and the woolly mammoth.
On August 11th of 2015, my grandparents and I drove from where they live in Washington State, about 200 miles into the desert, to watch a meteor shower. We found a windmill farm that was nice and dark, by a small field of overgrown grass or weed. So there we are, and I'm laying in the grass watching the stars, watching some strange objects, not a satellite, Not a space station, not a plane, and not a helicopter. I'm well familiar with all of the above, and both the size, light patterns, flight patterns, and stuff. This thing was completely unfamiliar. It also split into 6 smaller lights after spiraling around, and then reformed itself a couple of minutes after. When my grandfather's dog, a trained guard dog for his PTSD, supposed to warn him of anything dangerous, starts whimpering as we hear howling in the distance. My grandparents musses speculatively about the origin of the howling, saying it was not dogs nor coyote. Now, because they've both been known to be a little too into the paranormal, I ignored them. So, we are in this field for about 30 minutes, and I'm having a lovely time until I see something scuffling across the field towards us. It's hunched and dark, and has the inverted knees of an animal. It's about 5'6", and seems to be pacing around us in the field. The dog at this point starts going mad. But we drove so far to get there, I didn't say anything about the creature, knowing that my grandparents would immediately abandon our field. After a while, the dog started tracking 5 or 6 of these creatures out of the field, as it was losing the ability to keep them all where he could see it. My grandparents noticed, and we had to leave. So now I'm very mad and disappointed, because we really only spent half an hour to 40 minutes watching the shower, which was the whole point. So I asked my grandparents if we can pull over further along in the road to keep watching. As I'm looking back for a place for us to turn around and pull into, I see 2 glowing red eyes just behind our taillight, booking it after us. He ran hunched over, but it was the same creature from the field. Needless to say, I didn't insist we pull over. We drove for about 2 hours before the sun came up. At that point, we realized we were still about 3 hours away from home, and it was already 5 a.m. But we had already just left the field. You remember we arrived around midnight and spent a maximum of 30 to 40 minutes there? So what the hell happened in those 4 hours? None of us remember. The Giant Bird, as told by Miguel Ángel Becerril. This story took place near Mexico City, in the mountains of Xochimilco. It all started during my sleep. I began having nightmares. Something evil was watching me. The devil was lingering, bothering me. When morning broke, I had to go for a run. I was very disciplined back then, and used to go running the same mountain where the lizard man had been seen previously. I used to go every day. So I got up that morning, prepared myself, but something was off. I had this strange feeling, telling me that on this particular day, I shouldn't go on my run. Anyway, my sense of responsibility was stronger, and I forced myself to go. I always took one of my dogs with me. That day the weird feeling was so intense, I decided to take another dog with me. I chose a pit bull and my boxer. They made me feel safer. I've always had a lots of dogs. We headed to the mountain, and as we took the path into the woods, my mind started to flash a lot of images of demons. Something that had never happened to me before. I had been a regular to this place for years, and such a thing had never occurred. Then that day, it did. I started running with my 2 dogs on the leash, not feeling well at all. I've always believed in God. Only back then, I wasn't really convinced. Anyhow, I started praying because I had this horrible feeling, a presence of something, and the demonic images which I'd just seen. So I prayed during the first 3 kilometers, and kept watching my back because I felt this sharp sensation of being watched. As a matter of fact, I felt it since I woke up, and I kept going and continued with prayer. But at some point, I heard some kind of call. Something like a parrot, only much louder. Then I remembered that flocks of parrots were usual around this time of year. So I got curious and began to look up to see where their nests could possibly be. Some parrots make their nests on the ground. And for a moment I forgot how I had been feeling all the way up, and I tried to ignore them. My dogs were losing it by then and running straight ahead of me. But as I heard this sound again and again, I got obsessive with it and started to run so fast I ended up leaving my dogs behind. The sound started to come from everywhere, and it became compulsive. It was winter, so most of the trees were without leaves, and all you could see were the branches. From afar I noticed something move, not very high, because all of them were oak trees, and the feeling had grown stronger. As I kept following the sound through the branches, I saw two huge wings open, and a giant bird glide into another tree. But as soon as it reached it, the bird closed its wings and disappeared. I can recall it was of a very similar color to those branches. It was a bird, but one I'd never seen before. I've always liked animals, so I can recognize all the animals from the region. Note this one. I started to follow the bird frantically as it appeared again. Its wingspan was easily more than 2.5 meters, and it was colored in a distinctive yellowish brown. I saw it again, trying to follow it, and every time I kept going, I kept getting deeper into the mountain. So much so that I forgot all about my dogs. I don't know where all that strength came from, because that's a really difficult area to run in. It's incredibly steep. My dogs followed behind, panting with their tongues out, but I kept advancing, thinking that I have to discover what it is, and that I have to see it. See its head, and see its tail. But I never got to. I kept following it as it flew, but every time it stopped at some tree it would disappear. Those are really low trees, only about 3 meters tall or 3.5 at most, and you could see everything. I live in the country and usually love it. I'm a big Pokemon fan and have been for a long time. Last summer, I was playing a lot of Pokemon Go. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's a mobile game that requires you to walk in the real world to catch Pokemon. Post offices and town offices are usually places where you can get new items. Well, I have been busy one day and didn't get a chance to go out and play. It was dark before I had a chance. I decided to go ahead and go for a little walk. It is about a 1-mile round trip to the post office, and I've done it before and felt pretty safe about doing it again, as it's a very safe neighborhood. I grabbed my phone and headed out. It's a heavily wooded area with a few houses and field. I had just passed the neighbor's house when I heard it. There was a shuffling in the woods near me. I quickly got to the other side of the street. Deer were pretty common here, and I didn't want one to jump out and run into me. I expected a deer to run out and cross the road, but none came, and the noise got louder. I raised my phone up to see if I could use the light to see what it was. The light, however, was far too weak to illuminate everything, and I started walking quicker, and I thought it would just go away. I reached my neighbor's house that has rather overgrown fields, and could see the top of the grass move as whatever it was moved through it, but I still couldn't see it. Whatever it was stopped making noise. I reached the post office and checked into my game. Playing helped me relax, and I forgot about what had scared me. Then I turned and headed on. As I passed my neighbor's house within the long grass, I heard the movement again. It had waited suddenly. Mind you, I was at the post office for about 20 minutes because there was a lot to do on my game. And as I walked along, I kept my eyes on my feet and did not dare look into the woods. It was clear that whatever was there wasn't going to hurt me. It would have done so already, and I didn't want to risk seeing. I was terrified, and I could hear it crashing about the woods. I thought about calling my husband to come get me, but part of me was scared to make a noise. What if my silence was the only thing that had kept this thing from attacking? Finally, I reached a neighbor's house that had a big open yard. Whatever was following me stopped making noise, and it seemed like it was going away. I quickly rushed the short distance home and was shaking. I don't know what it was that followed me, and part of me doesn't ever want to know. My husband thinks it's just a curious bear or a coyote. That doesn't really make me feel any better.